let's get right to it. Christians in the U.S. and around the world are mourning the death of one of the 20th century's greatest religious figures, the Reverend Billy Graham. Suffering from cancer, pneumonia, and other ailments, Graham died peacefully Wednesday at home in North Carolina. He was 99. Ordained a Southern Baptist in 1939, by the late 1940s, he joined the then emerging movement. It was called the New Evangelicalism. The fiery young pastor began making a name for himself in 1949 during a Christian revival in Los Angeles. For nights on end, he preached in a packed tent he dubbed the Canvas Cathedral. He drew thousands to his message of Christ and God's love.
I do not believe that any man can solve the problems of life without Jesus Christ.
Over the next decade, his huge crusades in England and New York catapulted him to international celebrity. Eventually, his ministry reached more than 185 countries and territories as he preached to millions. He counseled every U.S. president from Dwight Eisenhower to George W. Bush and became known as America's pastor. Politically, Graham spoke out against communism in his early years and gay marriage in his last years. After Nixon's Watergate scandal, he told evangelicals they should never be too closely aligned with any particular party or person. However, almost on his own, he raised the profile of Christian conservatives who would come to rival the voting blocs of Catholics and liberal Protestants. Graham turned his ministry over to his son, Franklin, in 1995, only making occasional public appearances afterward. Ruth, his beloved wife of 64 years, died in 2007. Graham was once asked, what was the secret to his preaching? He answered, "The secret of my work is God. I would be nothing without him." Billy Graham's body will lie in honor at the U.S. Capitol. He's only the fourth private citizen to be so honored. Joining me now with his reflections on the late Billy Graham is a man who knew him very well indeed. He served as the media spokesman for Reverend Graham for 33 years. He's currently president of A. Larry Ross Communications. Please welcome Larry Ross, joining us tonight from Dallas, Texas. Larry, thank you for being here at this special time.
Thank you, Ray. It's good to talk with you again. We first met when you were covering the Passion of the Christ, and that, I think, really does sum up Mr. Graham's ministry of more than 60 years, 6 decades in public ministry. He had a real passion for lifting up the name of Jesus to the high and the low all around the world.
No, he certainly did. Now, you spent so much time with him privately, Larry. Give us a sense, amid all the tributes and the remembrances you're reading, what don't we know about Billy Graham that we should?
Well, people have asked me to sum up Billy Graham's life and ministry in one word. I can't do it. I have to use 4, and that would be integrity, humility, authenticity, and then love. And really, there weren't 2 Billy Grahams. The one that you would see preaching on television or in a stadium is the same one you'd meet with one-on-one. He just considered himself a country boy called to preach. He had no idea, was just overwhelmed that God would call him to have the type of influence and impact he had. And it was just a privilege to have a front row seat on all God did through his faithfulness to the calling on his life all those years.
He was amazing. You know, I've gone back over the last day or two watching some of his sermons, and when you see him as a young man in the 50s, he is on fire. I mean, I read a Bob Dylan tribute where he says, you know, this was the original rock and roll, you know, with that mane of hair, and that they called him God's machine gun early on because he would, you know, rat-tat-tat across the crowd.
Oh, yeah.
But really an amazing force of nature. And then, of course, he became the elder statesman of evangelists and really the Protestant
Well, he
Pope.
did, and he did. That's true. You mentioned his energy and passion in the early years. You know, he started out in youth evangelism with Youth for Christ. And interestingly, at the very end of his ministry, the last 22 crusades, we held what was called a youth night. And 17 of those would set stadium attendance records. So to have an 86-year-old evangelist setting stadium attendance records on youth night, that's a man bites dog story. Pretty amazing.
That is amazing. He had an interesting relationship too, Larry, and for the Catholics tuning in, who are a sizable part of this audience, Billy Graham was really a trailblazer in finding cooperation and reaching out to Catholics. And at a time when Catholics and Protestants viewed each other with suspicion, he was friends with Fulton Sheen, Archbishop Sheen, later John Paul II.
Right.
But in the 50s, tell us about the altar calls. He would often coordinate with local churches, most of them Protestant, but some of them Catholic.
That's right. In fact, every crusade that Mr. Graham held, there were 417 of them, during which he preached to live audiences of 215 million people in 185 countries. And they were always church-based, and Mr. Graham would only hold a crusade where he was invited and would only accept that invitation when he was assured of a broad representation of all of the churches and denominations in a community. And, you know, in recent years, beginning probably in the early to mid-90s, that did include Catholic congregations.
Right.
And everyone who came forward, Mr. Graham would say it wasn't mass evangelism, it was personal evangelism on a mass scale. Because everyone who came forward was met personally by a trained counselor and referred to a local church and neighborhood Bible study for follow-up. But in the case of the Catholic Church, they were referred to the diocese, so that the diocese then could determine to which local parish they would be sent.
Amazing. I know he was very close to John Paul II, and they were sort of kindred spirits. There's that great story Billy Graham writes about in his biography where John Paul comes up to him and grabs him by the lapel, and he says, "Graham, we are brothers." And, you know, the two of them did have this kinship. Tell me about that relationship.
Well, they did have a personal friendship. They met together 3 times, usually when Mr. Graham was over in that part of the world. In fact, Mr. Graham, when John Paul II was elected Pope, Mr. Graham was on with David Hartman on Good Morning America, and Mr. Hartman did not know how to pronounce his name, Cardinal Wojtyła.
Right.
And Mr. Graham had just preached in the cathedral in Krakow the week before, was able to help him out with that. But, you know, there's a communications principle, Ray, that the largest number of people focused on the smallest point of agreement gives you your greatest impact. And I believe that beyond their friendship, the point of agreement between Mr. Graham and Pope John Paul II was a burden for souls and a heart for evangelism. And I think that knit their hearts together and added to their friendship. And similarly, I think many times churches would come together. If I were to say, what's Mr. Graham's legacy? I would say, and I don't mean to discount all the millions of people that I believe will be in heaven because of his faithful preaching of the message of the gospel. But I believe that Mr. Graham brought unity, credibility, and visibility to the local church. And I think that's a big part of what he will be remembered for.
Larry, before I let you go, he was a spiritual counselor to every president from Eisenhower to George W. Bush. Why not President Obama? Well,
actually, Mr. Graham had a relationship with 12 presidents, beginning with Eisenhower, who was in office when he first came on the scene. Right. He spent more time with, President Truman,
right.
And spent more time with him after he got out of office. But with the exception of President Truman, Mr. Graham knew all these men long before they got into national office. And then, of course, when Mr. Obama came into office, Mr. Graham had already stepped down from public ministry. He never had an opportunity to meet him, but President-elect Obama, when he was campaigning, made sure that he kept in touch with Mr. Graham and went to visit him as well in his mountain home.
And Trump talks about listening to Graham, watching him, and being influenced by him as well. So it's an interesting lineage there.
In fact, the current president actually attended Mr. Graham's 95th birthday party with his wife before he actually was campaigning for his current position. And so they have a personal relationship as well.
Amazing. Larry Ross, thank you for being here, for your insight and your personal knowledge of Billy Graham. God rest his soul. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And for more insight into the life and legacy of Billy Graham, we're joined by his grandson from Fort Myers, Tullian Tchividjian. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Tell me about the man you called Daddy Billy.
Yeah, he was by far the most humble man I've ever met. I've said this to many different people, but the humility that the public saw was the same humility that we as family saw behind the scenes, and it was genuine. He was a genuinely humble man, a man who had accomplished so much in his lifetime, and yet at the same time didn't think he was a big shot at all, and didn't carry himself like he was a big shot. So his humility stands out, of course. His faithfulness stands out. I mean, here was a guy who was offered so many different opportunities to do so many different kinds of things throughout his lifetime, and he stayed focused on what God had called him to do, and he never got distracted. He never got off course. And so the man, his integrity, I mean, 60 years of public life without any hint of any kind of scandal is miraculous, in my opinion. So in the sense of his character, his integrity, his humility, his faithfulness, those are all things we saw. He was a devoted family man. He loved his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. He was just a remarkable figure in our family. But as much as important as he was as a man to us and to the world, really, I think it was his message that probably set him apart in ways that are otherworldly, in my opinion. He was absolutely devoted to saying one thing. And the one thing he was absolutely devoted to saying is that the essence of the Christian faith is not what we do for God, but what God in Christ has done for us. It's not our performance for God, but it's what God has accomplished for us in the person and work of his Son, Jesus Christ. And so that, to me, is what garnered so much respect, even from people of different faiths, because he had so much character and so much integrity in the way that he presented the timeless truth of the gospel.
Tullian, give me a sense of what sets him apart among the other evangelists of his day. Not only, you mentioned the simple message that he really carried through the entire 60-plus years of his ministry, but what was it that drew so many crowds and that distinguished him? There were televangelists, there were people who had tent revivals all over the world. Why did Billy Graham stand out?
Well, I mean, I think, when it came to just natural giftedness, he was remarkably charismatic, he was winsome, he was simple, he understood things at a profound level, but he was able to communicate those things very simply so that everyday people could understand what he was saying. He just had a lot of God-given gifts. But more than his natural gifts, which everybody could see, I think he would be the first to say that it was God's anointing on him. It wasn't so much that he was the smartest guy or the best speaker or the best preacher. He would often say, I'm just a country preacher from the outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina, from a dairy farm. So he didn't fancy himself as being the most gifted or the smartest or anything like that, but he really did recognize that God's hand was on him, that God had called him to preach the good news of Jesus to the whole world, and he never wavered off course. And so I think one of the things that sets him apart from lots of other preachers is just his absolute focus on the main thing. I mean, he just stuck to the main thing. He would tell me all the time, as I was growing into my preaching voice, he would tell me all the time, make a beeline for the cross, make a beeline for the cross, make a beeline for the cross. He always pointed away from himself and pointed to the person and work of Jesus.
Tullian, tell me and give me a sense of that last conversation you had with your grandfather, which you recount beautifully in a piece I read earlier. What was the content of that conversation? What do you remember of it?
What I remember mostly is just the time together. I would get with him and ask him all sorts of questions. You know, here is a guy who really, in so many ways, helped forge church history in the 20th century. And so as a theologian and seminarian myself at the time, I was so keenly interested in the people that he met and the way certain things and movements got started. But it was that last conversation where we didn't really talk so much about those things. He talked about the difficulty of getting old. He talked about how much he missed my grandmother, who died in June of 2007. He talked about how much he missed his friends, most of whom had died years ago, some of his closest friends. But then almost immediately he shifted the conversation away from himself and started asking me questions. How are your kids? How's Gabe? How's Nate? How's Jenna? How's your ministry going? What are the unique challenges and opportunities you're facing? What are you preaching on? He was always... he wasn't always advising. I've heard a lot over the last few days about what an amazing advisor and counselor he was to world leaders, presidents, and other world leaders, and he was that. But at the same time, he was a perpetual learner. He asked more questions than he gave answers. He was always wanting to learn more. I was telling my wife earlier today a story about the time I went to visit him 3 days after September 11th, 2001, and George Bush had just called him, George W. Bush had just called him and asked him if he would come and speak at the memorial service at the National Cathedral. And I mean, literally, he had just gotten off the phone with him probably 5 minutes before I walked in the door. And so he was sitting there, and I said, well, Daddy Bill, it doesn't surprise me at all that they asked you to do that. You know, people have always called on you in a time of crisis, especially a national crisis or a world crisis, because you bring such words of perspective and peace. And I said, so what are you going to say? And he looked at me and he said, well, what would you say? And I was at the time, you know, I was 30-something years old, maybe, you know, 28, 29 years old or something like that. And here he was sincerely and genuinely, he wasn't just patronizing me. I mean, he was sincerely and genuinely wanting to know, well, what would you say? He was always asking questions. He wanted to learn from everybody that he could learn from, even if it was someone, you know, 50, 60 years younger than him, like his grandson, who didn't know half as much as he knew. So, you know, I remember that last conversation, him asking me questions and wanting to know certain things. He would ask me Bible questions and theological questions. He knew that he was not a theologian or a scholar. He never fancied himself to be that. And so he surrounded himself with theologians and scholars because he wanted to learn, he wanted to grow, he wanted to develop. And so he was incredibly supportive of me, as he was all of his grandchildren and children, and just a doting grandfather and a remarkable father to my mother and her siblings. And we miss him already, and we know that we will see him again. But at this point, you know, it's hard for us who have been left behind. But I think the thought that made me happy immediately after the shock of hearing that Daddy Bill had died yesterday morning, the thought that he had been reunited with Tete, which is what we called my grandmother, his wife of over 60 years, someone I know he missed terribly, made me very happy.
Tullian Tchividjian, thank you so much for being with us, and our thoughts and prayers are with you and the family. Thank you for the memories.